Subtle. Confirming. Emily felt it then. Not fear. Recognition. A pattern forming where others saw nothing. She turned away before anyone could notice her attention linger. Servers weren't supposed to observe. They were supposed to disappear. That was the rule. That was the safety. But as she stepped back toward the service station, the hum of the room seemed to dull around her. The laughter sounded distant. The music faded. Her focus narrowed to one thing only. The contract folder placed neatly beside Daniel's right hand. Thick. Final. Waiting. A pen rested on top of it. Black. Expensive. Ready. Emily exhaled slowly, steadying her grip on the tray. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she misheard. Maybe she was reading too much into a fragment of conversation that didn't concern her. That was what most people would think. That was why most people stayed silent. But Emily Carter didn't trust maybe. She trusted patterns. And this one didn't feel right. Not at all. She glanced once more toward the table, just as Daniel leaned back in his chair, a faint, confident smile crossing his face as he reached for the pen. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, hidden beneath polished wood and polite conversation, Emily knew something no one else in the room did. If he signed that paper, everything would change. Emily did not move right away as Daniel's fingers closed around the pen, her body still but her mind accelerating, connecting fragments that refused to stay random. The whisper had not been isolated. It had tone, timing, intent. And now, as she watched from the edge of the room, she noticed something else. The man who had spoken earlier did not look at the contract. He did not lean forward like the others. He simply watched Daniel, waiting, not interested in the terms, only the outcome. That was not how investors behaved. That was how someone behaved when the result was already decided. Emily turned toward the service station, setting her tray down with deliberate care, her fingers brushing the cool metal surface as she grounded herself. Think, not react. She had learned that the hard way years ago. Acting too soon meant exposing yourself. Acting too late meant losing everything. Her eyes flicked to the reflection in the polished steel, catching the table behind her without turning her head. Daniel was speaking again, calm, confident, explaining final clauses with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. The others nodded. Of course they did. He was Daniel Whitmore. He did not make mistakes. But Emily's gaze narrowed slightly as she listened, not to his words, but to the silence around them. The quiet gaps. The way the two men at the far end exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second too long. Agreement. Confirmation. Not curiosity. She exhaled slowly and reached for a water pitcher, giving herself a reason to return to the table. Her steps were measured, each one controlled, as if she were simply continuing her shift. Invisible. Unimportant. Safe. She stopped beside Daniel's chair, refilling his glass without a sound, the faint trickle of water masking the way she leaned just slightly closer. "Sir," she said softly, her voice calm, almost neutral, "you may want to review page 14 again." Daniel did not look at her at first. He simply held up a finger, a silent request for patience, his attention still on the man across from him. Dismissal without even a glance. Emily did not flinch. She had expected that. She straightened, placing the pitcher back on the tray, her expression unchanged, but her eyes moved once more to the contract. Page 14. She had not seen the document, but she knew patterns. Deals like this always hid their real terms in the middle. Not the beginning, not the end. The middle, where attention drifted. Daniel finally turned his head, just slightly, his gaze brushing over her like she was part of the furniture. "We are in the middle of something," he said quietly, not unkind, but firm. A boundary, a reminder of roles. Emily met his eyes for the briefest moment. Not challenging, not apologizing, just steady. "Yes, sir," she replied, just as quietly. Then she stepped back. From the outside, nothing had happened. A waitress had spoken out of turn. A CEO had corrected her. Order restored. But inside, the tension had shifted, subtle but real. Because as Emily walked away, she saw it. Not in Daniel. Not yet. But in the man at the far end of the table. A flicker. Small. Controlled. But unmistakable. Concern. Someone had noticed the interruption. And that meant one thing. She had touched something real. Emily reached the service station again, her pulse steady but her thoughts sharper now, more certain. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a coincidence. Something was wrong with that deal. And if Daniel Whitmore signed it, the whisper would not just be words anymore. It would become reality. And no one else in that room was going to stop it. Daniel Whitmore did not return to the contract immediately after Emily stepped away. Though from the outside it looked as if nothing had changed, his posture still relaxed, his tone still controlled, his attention still on the men across from him. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, something small enough that only someone watching closely would notice. And Emily was watching, not directly, not obviously, but through reflections, through timing, through the quiet spaces. Between movements, because Daniel's hand hovered just a fraction longer than it should have before touching the page again, and his eyes, for the briefest moment, flicked to the middle of the document instead of the signature line. Just as she had suggested, not because he trusted her, not yet, but because confidence did not erase curiosity, and curiosity, even in someone like him, could not fully ignore a voice that did not belong in the script, especially when that voice carried no fear, no apology, only quiet certainty. And across the table, the man who had spoken earlier shifted in his seat, almost imperceptibly, adjusting his cuff as if the room had grown warmer, though the temperature had not changed, and the others continued speaking, filling the air with numbers and projections, unaware that the rhythm had been broken, unaware that a single sentence from someone they did not even see had introduced doubt into a room built on control. Emily stood at the service station with her hands resting lightly on the counter, her expression composed, her breathing steady, but her focus sharpened to a single point. Daniel's eyes, because that was where the decision would happen, not in the words being spoken, not in the smiles exchanged, but in the moment he chose whether to think or to proceed, and she could see it now, the shift from automatic to deliberate, the way he turned one page back instead of forward, the way his thumb paused at the edge as if weighing something unseen, and then he stopped speaking altogether, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet pause that caused the man across from him to lean in slightly. Waiting, watching, calculating. Is something unclear? The man asked with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes, and Daniel did not answer right away, his gaze fixed on a paragraph buried in the center of the document, his expression tightening just enough to register as focus, not concern, not yet, but enough to slow the room, enough to create space where there had been none. Emily felt it like a current shifting direction, the conversation faltering, the certainty cracking. And then Daniel spoke, his voice still calm, but different now, sharper, more precise. This clause, he said, tapping the page lightly with the tip of his pen, was not in the draft we reviewed last week. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. The man at the far end of the table straightened, his fingers tightening slightly against the edge of his glass before relaxing again, too quickly, too controlled. And the others began to look down at their own copies, flipping pages, scanning lines they had not paid attention to before. And in that moment, Emily knew she had done it, not by force, not by confrontation, but by creating hesitation, because hesitation was enough. Hesitation meant time, and time meant exposure. Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from the page to the faces around him, no longer assuming alignment, no longer trusting the flow. And for the first time that evening, the man who had everything under control was not following the script that had been written for him. He was rewriting it, and all it had taken was one quiet sentence from someone he had almost ignored. Emily did not move, did not react, did not allow even the smallest heightened, because this was the moment where truth either surfaced or was buried again, and she could see it in the micro-expressions, the flicker of irritation in the man's eyes before it disappeared, the slight delay before his response, the way his colleague leaned in just a fraction too quickly as if to support him. "I believe you are overanalyzing a routine clause," the second man added, his tone lighter, almost dismissive. But it came too fast, too eager, and Daniel noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything when he chose to, and now he was choosing. His gaze lifted slowly from the document to the two men, and for the first time that evening, he was not seeing partners, he was assessing variables. "Then it should be easy to remove," he said simply, no edge, no raised voice, just a statement. And that was when the shift became undeniable. The air in the room tightening as the expectation of a smooth signing dissolved into something else entirely. The first man's smile held. But it no longer looked effortless. It looked maintained, constructed. Our board has already approved this version, he replied, carefully. Any changes would delay the process. Daniel leaned back slightly, the pen still in his hand but no longer near the page. Then we delay, he said, just as calmly, and the words settled over the table like a line drawn in quiet ink. Not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. Because for someone like him, delay was not inconvenience. It was control, and he had just taken it back. Emily exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not relief. Not yet. But recognition. The pattern had broken. The script had shifted, and whatever had been planned was no longer moving forward as intended. But she also knew something else, something that settled deeper than the initial warning. People who built traps did not abandon them easily. They adjusted, they redirected, they found another way. And as she watched the two men exchange another glance, quicker this time, sharper, she understood that this was not the end of it, not even close, because the whisper had not said delay. It had said he loses everything. And that kind of outcome did not rely on a single clause. It relied on layers, on backup plans, on contingencies that activated when the first move failed. Emily's eyes moved once more to the table, to the contract, to Daniel, and then to the men who had just lost their certainty. And in the quiet space that followed, she realized the most important part of all. Stopping the signature had only bought time. Now she had to understand what that time was protecting him from. The silence that followed was not empty. It was active, shifting, recalculating, as if every person at the table was quietly rewriting their next move. And Daniel Whitmore did not rush to fill it. He simply closed the folder halfway, not rejecting it, not accepting it, placing it in a position that meant one thing only: not yet. And that single decision changed the rhythm of the entire room. The confidence that had once flowed easily now hesitated, measured, careful, and across from him. The two men adjusted almost in sync, one reaching for his glass, the other leaning back just slightly, creating space where pressure had been building. Perhaps we should take a short break, the second man suggested, his tone light, controlled, but edged with something new, urgency hidden beneath politeness. Daniel considered it for a moment, then nodded once, slow and deliberate. 5 minutes, he said, setting the boundary without negotiation. Chairs shifted, jackets were adjusted, phones appeared in hands, and the room began to disperse into smaller movements, smaller conversations. But Emily did not move right away, because this was the moment she had been waiting for. Not the signing, not the confrontation, but the fracture, when people believed they were no longer being watched, when patterns loosened just enough to reveal what had been hidden. She lifted her tray again, stepping forward with quiet purpose, her path taking her past the far end of the table, close enough to hear without appearing to listen. The two men had moved slightly apart from the others, their voices lowered, their posture angled inward, and Emily slowed her pace just enough, the faint clink of glassware masking her presence. He noticed too early. One of them muttered, the accent clearer now, sharper in the reduced noise. It does not matter, the other replied quickly. The secondary clause still holds if he proceeds tomorrow. Emily's steps did not falter, but her mind locked onto the words, secondary clause, tomorrow. This was not a single trap. It was layered, designed to survive scrutiny, designed to adapt. She continued past them without turning her head, her expression unchanged, her pace steady. But inside, everything sharpened, because now she understood. Stopping the signature tonight was only delaying the outcome, not preventing it. Whatever had been built into that contract extended beyond one meeting, beyond one document. It was structured to unfold over time. She reached the service station again, setting the tray down as her fingers tightened slightly against the edge. Not from fear, but from focus. She needed more than fragments, more than whispers. She needed the full pattern. Her eyes lifted, scanning the room. Daniel stood near the window now, phone in hand, speaking quietly, his posture straight, composed, but no longer relaxed. He was thinking, recalibrating, and for the first time, he was alone, not surrounded by advisors, not buffered by conversation, just him and the decision he had paused. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then made a choice, not impulsive, not emotional, but calculated. Because waiting longer meant losing the advantage she had created, she picked up a single glass, giving herself a reason, and walked toward him, each step measured, each movement controlled, until she stood just within speaking distance, close enough to be heard, far enough to remain respectful. Daniel ended his call, lowering the phone slowly as he sensed her presence, his eyes shifting toward her, not dismissive this time, not indifferent, but assessing, aware. "You heard something," he said quietly, not a question, not quite an accusation, but a recognition. Emily met his gaze, steady, unflinching. "More than something," she replied, her voice calm, precise. "And it is not over tonight." The words settled between them, simple, direct, carrying more weight than their volume suggested. Daniel studied her for a moment, longer than before, as if measuring not just what she said, but how she said it, the certainty, the absence of hesitation, the lack of any visible motive. And in that brief, quiet exchange, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but between them, because for the first time, he was not looking at her as part of the background. He was listening. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that silence was not hesitation. It was evaluation, the kind that stripped away assumptions and replaced them with intent. His eyes holding Emily's for a moment longer than before, searching not for confidence, but for inconsistency, and finding none, he shifted slightly, angling his body just enough to create a space that was no longer accidental, but deliberate. "Then tell me," he said quietly, his voice lower now, controlled, but no longer dismissive. And Emily did not rush to answer, because words mattered, and timing mattered more. She let a single second pass, just enough to ensure that what she said would land exactly where it needed to. "There is a second clause," she said, her tone even, precise. "Not in the section you questioned, but tied to it. Activated later, not tonight." Daniel's expression did not change much, but his focus sharpened, narrowing slightly as he processed the structure of what she was describing. "What does it do?" he asked, direct, efficient, and Emily met his gaze without flinching. "It transfers control indirectly," she replied. "Not ownership on paper, but operational authority through conditions that appear standard, until they are triggered." The words were technical, but her delivery was simple, stripped of unnecessary detail, and Daniel understood enough to feel the weight of it. Because deals like this were not built on obvious deception, they were built on layers that only revealed their purpose. When it was too late, he glanced briefly toward the table, where the two men were now speaking to others, their composure restored on the surface, but their movements slightly tighter, more controlled. "And you heard this," he said, not questioning her intelligence, but the source, the proof, and Emily nodded once, small, certain. "Part of it," she said. "Enough to know this does not end with tonight." Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand lowering the phone completely now, his attention fully on her, the noise of the room fading again as his mind recalculated, not just the deal, but the people involved, the timing, the intent behind every adjustment that had seemed insignificant before. "Why tell me?" he asked then, the question simple, but carrying layers beneath it, motive, risk, reason. Emily did not look away. "Because you were about to sign," she answered, just as simply, no embellishment, no appeal, just fact. And for a moment, that was enough, because there was no advantage in her voice, no expectation, no attempt to leverage what she knew, only the quiet presence of someone who had seen something and chosen to act. Daniel studied her again, more carefully this time, noticing details he had ignored before, the steadiness of her posture, the absence of nervous movement, the way she held his gaze without challenge, without submission, just clarity. And something in that steadiness shifted his final hesitation into decision, not about the deal, but about her. "If you are wrong," he said, his tone still calm, but edged now with consequence. "You understand what this interruption costs." Emily nodded once, accepting the weight of that without reaction. "Yes," she said, and nothing more, because she did not need to defend what she already knew. Daniel held her gaze for one more second, then gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not yet, but acknowledgement, and turned back toward the table, his posture different now, not the man who had been ready to conclude, but the one who had decided to dismantle. Emily stepped back without another word, returning to the edge of the room, her role unchanged on the surface, but everything beneath it now in motion, because the next move would not be quiet, not subtle, not hidden in clauses or whispers. It would be visible, deliberate, and it would force the truth into the open. And as Daniel walked back toward the table, the men who had been waiting for him straightened again, expecting resolution, expecting continuation, unaware that the direction had already changed, unaware that the person they had planned to outmaneuver was no longer following their design. And in the quiet space between expectation and reality, the balance of power began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the only way that mattered. Control was moving, one decision at a time. Daniel Whitmore did not sit down right away when he returned to the table, and that alone was enough to shift every eye toward him. Because men like him did not hesitate without reason. They did not interrupt their own rhythm unless something had changed, and now it had. He placed the folder back on the table with deliberate precision, not opening it, not pushing it forward, just setting it there as if redefining its importance. And then he looked up, not at everyone, but directly at the two men who had been guiding the conversation earlier, his gaze steady, controlled, and unmistakably different from before. "We are not signing tonight," he said, his voice calm, even, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the words settled into the room like a quiet shock. No raised voices, no dramatic reactions, but the tension was immediate, visible in the way shoulders stiffened, in the way hands paused mid-motion, in the way the carefully constructed flow of the meeting came to a complete stop. The first man recovered quickly. Of course he did, his smile returning with practiced ease. "I am sure we can address any remaining concerns efficiently," he replied, leaning forward slightly, his tone measured, persuasive. "There is no need to delay what is clearly a mutually beneficial agreement." Daniel did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch again, longer this time, allowing the weight of his decision to settle before he added to it. "There is every need," he said, simply, and then he opened the folder, not to sign, but to review, turning directly to the middle section, his finger resting on the clause he had identified earlier. "This language is not only different," he continued. "It is strategically placed." His eyes lifted briefly, scanning the table, not seeking approval, but ensuring attention, which suggests intent, not oversight. The second man shifted in his seat, his expression tightening just slightly before smoothing again. "You are reading too much into standard legal structuring," he said, his tone lighter, but the edge was there now, subtle, controlled. Daniel closed the folder again, this time fully, his hand resting on top of it, claiming it, controlling it. "Then we will have our legal team review it in full," he said. "Tonight." The addition was quiet, but it landed harder than anything before it, because it removed time from the equation. It removed the advantage of delay, and for the first time, the balance tipped visibly. The two men exchanged a glance, quicker, sharper, no longer hidden behind casual conversation, and Emily saw it from across the room. The shift from confidence to calculation, the realization that the path they had planned was narrowing, that the window they had relied on was closing. She remained still, her presence unchanged, but her awareness heightened, because this was the moment where pressure forced truth into motion. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed again, but not in the same way as before. This was not ease. This was control regained. "If everything is as standard as you say," he added, his voice steady, "then transparency will not be a problem." The room held that statement for a second, two, three, and in that space, the illusion of simplicity began to dissolve. The first man's smile faltered, just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "Of course," he said finally, but the word came slower now, heavier, and it did not carry the same certainty it had before. Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging the response without accepting it fully, and then he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal the end of the current phase. "We will reconvene after review," he said, and with that, the direction was set, no longer theirs to guide, no longer theirs to control. Emily watched as the men at the table adjusted once more, their movements more guarded now, their expressions more measured, because they understood what had happened even if they did not say it. The deal had not just been delayed, it had been exposed to scrutiny, and scrutiny was where hidden structures failed. She exhaled slowly, her focus steady, because this was not the end, not yet. The whisper had promised more, and promises like that did not disappear. They adapted, they shifted, they waited, and as Daniel turned slightly, his gaze finding hers across the room for just a brief moment, there was something new in it, not gratitude, not yet, but recognition. And that was enough to know that the next move would not be made alone. The meeting did not end with noise. It ended with restraint, chairs sliding back softly, quiet acknowledgments exchanged, hands shaken with practiced professionalism. But beneath it all, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, the kind of shift that lingered long after people left the room. Daniel Whitmore stepped away from the table last, the folder now closed and held firmly in his hand. No longer just a document, but a question waiting to be answered, and as the others filtered out, their voices low, their movements controlled, he did not follow immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his attention moving across the room with intention, not searching, but locating, and it landed on Emily Carter, who stood exactly where she had been before, composed, still, as if nothing about the evening had required her to change, and for a moment, the distance between them held, not physical, but defined by everything that had been unspoken until now. Daniel closed that distance with measured steps, each one deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, simply decided. "You said it was not over tonight," he said quietly when he reached her, his voice lower now, absent of the authority he had used at the table, replaced instead with something more precise, more focused. Emily nodded once, her gaze steady. "It is not," she replied, her tone calm, but certain, and Daniel studied her again, not as a curiosity this time, but as a variable he could not ignore. "Then where does it continue?" he asked, direct, because time was no longer abstract, it was immediate, and Emily did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because she was choosing how much to say, how much to reveal, her eyes shifting briefly toward the hallway that led to the private offices, then back to him. "They expected you to sign," she said. Everything after that was designed to follow without resistance. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because that was how control worked, not through force, but through sequence. And she continued, her voice still even. "Now that you did not, they will adjust, but they will not walk away. Not yet." Daniel glanced toward the door where the two men had exited moments earlier, his mind already mapping possibilities, timelines, pressure points. "And the second clause," he said. "You are certain?" Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said, a single word, but it carried the same quiet weight as before, no explanation, no defense, just certainty. And for a second, Daniel said nothing, because certainty without motive was rare, and rare things required careful handling. Then he nodded once, small, controlled. "My team will find it," he said, more to himself than to her. But Emily shook her head slightly, a subtle movement, but enough to stop the thought. "They will look where it is obvious," she said. "This is not obvious." The words settled between them, not challenging, not dismissing, but redirecting, and Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly as he understood what she meant, because deals like this were not built on what could be found easily. They were built on what was overlooked, what was dismissed as routine, what blended in until it was too late. "Then show me," he said, the decision made in the space of a breath, and Emily did not react outwardly, but something in her focus sharpened, because this was the point where observation became action, where staying invisible was no longer enough. She turned slightly, not toward him, but toward the service corridor that ran behind the dining room, her movements still measured, still controlled, but no longer passive. "We do not have much time," she said quietly, not urgent, but precise, and Daniel followed without hesitation, leaving behind the polished table, the controlled environment, the illusion of clarity, stepping instead into a narrower space, where the light was dimmer, the sounds sharper, the distance between cause and effect much shorter. And as they moved, Emily's voice came again, just above a whisper. "The first clause was bait," she said. "The second is the trap." And in that quiet corridor, Away from the eyes that had watched them before, the truth of the night began to take shape, not as a possibility, but as something real, something designed, something that had not expected to be seen until now. The corridor was quieter than the dining room, but not silent. The distant hum of voices still carried through the walls, softened, blurred, as if the world they had just left behind was already becoming less certain, less controlled. Emily Carter slowed her steps just enough to stay ahead, without leading too obviously, her awareness fixed not only on where they were going, but on what they might encounter along the way. Because plans like the one she had sensed rarely existed in isolation. They relied on proximity, on timing, on access, and access meant movement. She stopped near a service alcove where a narrow counter held a stack of documents left behind by staff earlier in the evening. Menus, reservation lists, internal notes, nothing that would stand out to anyone who was not looking for it. Daniel Whitmore stepped closer, his posture still composed, but his attention fully engaged now, no longer divided, no longer filtered through assumption. "Here," Emily said quietly, her fingers moving to a clipboard tucked beneath the top layer, sliding it free with a precision that suggested familiarity, not with the place, but with the process of noticing what others ignored. She turned it slightly so he could see, not presenting it, not explaining yet, just revealing. Daniel leaned in, his eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing as recognition began to form. The document was not part of the contract, not directly. It was an internal coordination sheet, a timeline, a sequence of follow-up actions scheduled for the next day, names, times, locations, and then a line that did not belong among routine logistics, a reference number that matched the clause he had questioned, but extended beyond it, tied to an external authorization, conditional, delayed, triggered not by signing alone, but by a confirmation event scheduled hours later. His gaze sharpened, tracing the connection, the structure, the intent behind it. "They built it outside the contract," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and Emily nodded once, small, certain. "So it would not be questioned at the table," she replied, her voice steady. Daniel straightened slightly, the weight of the realization settling into something more defined, more actionable, because this was no longer a suspicion, it was a system, designed to move forward even if parts of it were challenged, designed to complete itself unless someone understood the whole. He looked at the document again, then back at Emily. "You found this how?" he asked, not doubting, but mapping, and Emily did not hesitate. "Patterns," she said simply. They prepared for tomorrow before tonight was finished. The answer was not technical, but it was enough, because it aligned with everything he was seeing, everything he was now recalculating. Daniel took a slow breath, his mind already shifting from defense to response, because stopping the deal was no longer the objective. Understanding it was, dismantling it was. He reached for his phone again, but this time his movements were different, more precise, more controlled. "My legal team will need this," he said, already composing the next step, but Emily's voice stopped him, not louder, not urgent, just clear. "If you send it now, they will know you have it," she said, and he paused, the truth of that settling immediately, because exposure worked both ways, and timing mattered more than action. He lowered the phone slowly, his eyes returning to the document, then to her, and in that moment, something shifted fully into place, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but alignment. "Then we move first," he said, the decision quiet, but absolute. Emily met his gaze, steady, unflinching, and gave a small nod, not agreement, not approval, just recognition, because that was always the moment that mattered, not when someone realized the truth, but when they chose to act on it. And in the narrow space of that service corridor, far from the polished table and the controlled conversation, the outcome of the night changed completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through awareness, timing, and the quiet refusal to ignore what others missed. And as Daniel folded the document carefully, no longer just a CEO protecting a deal, but someone protecting something far larger, he looked at Emily one last time, not as a server, not as a stranger, but as the reason the pattern had broken at all. And he did not say thank you. He did not need to, because some moments did not require words, they required understanding. And as they stepped back toward the light, toward the world that had almost moved forward without question. One truth remained. Clear, simple, and impossible to ignore. The people no one notices are often the ones who see everything.